So, Kate, this has been a very big week for energy and climate change news. Jeremy mentioned Stanford's decision to divest from its coal holdings, but we also had the release of the National Climate Assessment from the federal government, which is the most plain-spoken report yet, I think, from the US government about the impacts, both impacts already here and impacts to be expected of climate change in the US. And yesterday, President Obama gave what was billed as a major speech on energy policy in California. So I'm going to throw you a big question first. Could you give us a quick overview of what you think the state of play is right now, where you think there are promising openings for policy change, and what you think the biggest challenges are right now?
That is a big question.
Yep.
So all the things you just mentioned, or the big things you just mentioned about this week, I think importantly, two of them were from the administration and one of them was from a private university. And strikingly, none of them were from Congress, which is not that surprising in the current atmosphere. I mean, in the US, everyone's heard it a million times, but in the US, essentially what we have is a failure to act by Congress. Even the Shaheen-Portman bill, which is an energy efficiency bill that's bipartisan and very unobjectionable, is having a hard time getting through Congress because every time it comes up to the floor, somebody will attach Keystone to it or somebody will attach the minimum wage raises to it. I mean, it's just not getting anywhere because this is just an unbelievably polarized issue in Washington, and I don't think you can overstate that, how polarized it is. It's really shocking. The administration is doing everything it can to work independently and with executive power. So the National Climate Assessment, this is actually a mandated assessment that happens every 4 years. This was by far the farthest reaching one that's come out. And really what it does, which I think is cool, I have a degree in planning and I do regional economic development, so I like regionalism in general. And what the NCA does is to take the country and divide it into 8 regions and look at them very specifically and say, what are the impacts from climate change in these regions, and how do we look at the country not as a monolith, but as these very particular climate zones? And it's really, really interesting and has generated a lot of attention, but again, we didn't see a big statement from Congress of a response to that. I mean, it's still really sort of in an echo chamber. Globally,
in an echo chamber, except for local governments and state governments.
Local governments are definitely. I mean, local governments are at the sort of front lines of all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, here we are in New York. Hurricane Sandy is a great example of this. Mayor Bloomberg, with whom we work a lot, became a convert, really, because of a local response to a big extreme weather event. I mean, local climate impacts are inherently extremely local. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that the National Climate Assessment really points out is different parts of the country have very different impacts, but they're very, very localized impacts. The solutions people are coming up with, the adaptation they're doing, and some of the solutions they're coming up with are pretty local. But the bottom line about this issue is that it's not even just a national issue, it's a global issue. So we have these very local impacts, very local responses. We have a lack of a national response, which means that places like New York or New Orleans have to deal with climate impacts with almost no federal support, which is pretty hard to do. It's very expensive to change all of your infrastructure in response to climate impacts without federal support. And then they're also dealing with it in a global context where we can't reach a global deal on climate. And that's the other big picture policy issue, is the sort of ongoing UN discussions and leading up to, as Jeremy said, Paris 2015. So.
Which we should come back to, because I heard Jeremy being optimistic about Paris 2015, right, William?
I heard that too.
Hear whether he thinks he's optimistic for the US to play a role as well. You moved to, actually talking about local impacts and national issues and impacts is a perfect segue. You moved from DC, where you were at the Center for American Progress, right, to California a couple of years ago. And you're now deeply involved in advocacy on the state level in California as well as on national issues. California is way ahead of the rest of the country on all of these issues. So how did that happen? Why? California's had all kinds of budget troubles, not so much lately. Go Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
But how did they move so fast or far compared to the rest of us?
California is fascinating. I mean, I have to say, I'm out there, and it's kind of wonderful to go from DC, where I lived through the Waxman-Markey cap and trade deal or lack of a deal, to California, where all these things are happening. There's a bunch of different answers to that. So let me first talk about the very positive California story that we all know. AB 32, it's Assembly Bill 32, is the name that covers 3 major bills in California. One of them is the cap and trade program, which allows people to trade carbon credits on a market. It's just the electricity sector. Importantly, the transportation sector will come under that in 2015, and that is a huge deal. It'll be the first time in the world that that's happened, and it's going to be very interesting. The second piece is our renewable energy standard, which is 33% renewable energy by 2020, and we're already at 25%, so it looks pretty doable. And then the third part of that is our low carbon fuel standard, which is the most controversial piece of that. Requires our fuel itself to become 10% less carbon intensive by 2020. So there are 3 different things happening. We have a cap and trade system pricing carbon over here. We have this goal on renewables, and we have this carbon intensivity goal on fuels. We are doing, and how did that happen? It was a product of a whole bunch of interesting things. I mean, it happened in 2006. People often don't remember that's when we passed all this stuff. It was a while ago. Only 4 legislators remain in our legislature who passed this bill. Only 4.
Wow. Because
we have term limit, very harsh term limits in California. So 4 of them are left. Most people think it wouldn't pass today if it were in this legislature. It passed at a time, it passed before the recession, importantly, and it passed at a time when we had a Republican governor who was a huge champion of it, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So a lot of interesting things going on at that moment. That was also a moment where nationally we were talking about oil independence and the need for oil security. It was before the boom. So it was a different moment, and I think it's a really interesting question how much of those historical artifacts have to do with the fact that it actually passed. But it passed, and it's going really well. The auctions for the credits have gone very, very well. It's going extremely well. What I'll say about it, though, is it's going very well, particularly on the electricity side. And so this is what I mean when California is an interesting place. On the transportation side, we still in California, 97% of our transportation fuel is petroleum. Our transportation is petroleum-based. We are very dependent on transportation. I was saying to Rosalie earlier, even in the Bay Area, the densest part of California, the most urban density in California, almost 80% of our commuters use cars. So it is a very car-driven place. We are also the 3rd largest oil producer in the country. And so there's a whole other story going on with California, which is our oil story. We're a huge producer, and we don't tax our oil. We don't have a severance tax, unlike Texas, unlike Louisiana. So we have this electricity, gangbusters, renewables, clean tech story, and then we have this totally other, this 2 faces of California, this oil producer, oil infrastructure story, and the 2 are just now starting to clash, interestingly, around the low carbon fuel standard, which the oil companies hate, and around the Monterey Shale, which Jeremy didn't talk about, but the single biggest potential oil shale deposit in the United States is in California. And it's not yet tapped. And the Energy Information Agency thinks that there are 15 billion barrels under there, but it's extremely hard to get at. I can talk more about that. But so it's all kind of coming together around the Monterey Shale.
How can it possibly be that California doesn't have a severance tax on
Well, we have our oil. It's a political artifact to some extent. It's come up 27 times in our legislature and never passed.
Anytime recently?
Yes, it's on the ballot. It's on right now. It's currently Noreen Evans, legislator, has it up. And actually, our organization, Next Generation, was founded by Tom Steyer, who some of you may have heard of, who has a big kind of public information campaign going on around this right now in the state. It's an interesting artifact of the fact that we have a supermajority of our legislators are Democrats, and those are almost entirely from coastal urban areas. So California is a weird state. 40% of our legislators are from Los Angeles, just because of density issues. But we have a really key constituency of moderate Democrats in the Central Valley who are in oil counties, oil-producing counties. Mm-hmm. So that's really where where it plays out.
You said that it's the first time in the world. Is that what you said? That they on the transportation
that it'll come under a cap and trade system.
So how is that? I mean, that's coming up pretty soon. So what preparations are being made to make that work?
Well, we have these 3 things going on with oil right now in policy in California. We have the low carbon fuel standard, which is under massive legal attack. So it's an interesting question what happens with that. Trying to bring down the intensivity of our actual oil or our fuels in the state. We have the potential severance tax, and then we have fuels coming under the cap and trade system. And all of those, I mean, the Western States Petroleum Association, which is the trade association of the oil industry out there, is just fighting them all. It's sort of a big battle to see which of them is weakest and try to get rid of one and get that to get rid of the other two. What's being done to prepare for it? A lot of companies are trying to figure that out. I mean, they're starting to price it into their budgets. They are thinking about how it's going to affect them. But I've been amazed. I've talked to a lot of investors in California about this who talk to these companies, and many of them aren't even thinking about it yet.
Your other full-time day job, you have two, is Risky Business, and which is going to launch in June, I think, or it's kind of launched, but you're going to launch your big analysis in June. Could you talk some more about who's involved, what the strategy is, what you hope to accomplish?
Sure, and it builds really nicely off of what Jeremy said. This is also a project about risk, really. So part of my life is this state-level energy policy stuff, and then the other part is big picture, agenda setting, change the conversation on climate, and that's really what Risky Business is. This is a project that we started with three co-chairs, and we're really excited about these three, with Tom Steyer himself, and then Mike Bloomberg, who you all know well, and Hank Paulson, who was, of course, the Treasury Secretary during the financial crisis. And those three have brought together 7 others, and together they form a risk committee that's looking at the actual risk the United States faces from climate change up through 2100 and what the cost of that risk might be. We approached this really, just going back to how we started to come up with this project, we really approached it. I was sort of thinking, why don't we ever talk about climate in economic terms? Why do we still have this old jobs versus the environment thing around climate? And looking at how the Stern Review in 2006 played out in Europe, and Sir Nicholas Stern wrote this great report from inside the government that talked about the cost of action versus the cost of inaction on climate, and was really compelling in the European markets, I think, in terms of making this an economic issue. Though some people here paid attention to it, it fell fairly flat here in the United States. So we took a step back and said, why didn't that work here, and what would work here? And it honestly was really a cultural analysis. I mean, we sort of said, okay, what are the things about the Stern Review that didn't work particularly well in the United States because of how we are culturally? It came from inside the government. And here in the United States, we are at an all-time low in terms of government, trust in government and faith in government. So we thought, okay, let's not have it come from within the government. It came from somebody who was really an economist and an analyst. And we were like, okay, who do we listen to in terms of economics here in the United States? We listen to markets. We don't necessarily listen to economists. So we made it a very market-driven approach. Risky Business is a classic risk analysis of climate. And then we thought, okay, can't come from within Washington or the government, can't come from traditional economists. We knew it couldn't come from the environmental community because just nobody listens to the environmental community on this issue if they're talking about economics. They certainly listen to the environmental community on the environment. And then we wanted it to be bipartisan and a kind of a diverse set of people. So we really organized it to be not macroeconomic, but market-based, not within the government, but private, influential-based, and very much in the language of business. So our goal here is really to change the conversation about climate to be one about business, very similar to what Jeremy's doing, very complementary, and then to engage these influential people that we have on board in a conversation, sometimes private, one-on-one with CEOs, peer-to-peer conversation with investors and CEOs to say, hey, you need to be reacting to this within your own companies, but more than that, you need to be working with us to see the limits of your reaction and to make this a public sector issue. So we're really trying to organize with these influentials, but going about it in a very different way.
Is there any part of a preview that you could give us of anything that you found?
I can tell you, so we're launching here, actually, in New York on June 24th. I can tell you only a little because one other thing that we did with this project after watching what happened to Nick Stern after he put out his project and the unbelievable number of attacks that he got from economists on the methodology. We tried to be as bulletproof as possible with ours. So it's currently being reviewed, peer-reviewed by 15 different economists and scientists. So, so I can only talk a little about it. I will say, though, that we build on the modeling. We stand on the shoulders, really, of the National Climate Assessment. We've talked to those guys a lot. And we do regional modeling, but we also will be modeling down to the state and the county level in some cases. And we will be doing, instead of just looking at the median case of what may happen, we're looking at something that's pretty classic in the business world. We're looking at the risk tails. So we're looking at the potential 1 in 20, 1 in 100 risks as well. And then we're costing all of that out. So that's new.
And so the process in terms of influencing, you're going to start with influentials, influence other influentials, and then those other influentials are going to influence Congress?
I think that the theory is, how do we make climate into a sober, grown-up conversation in the United States? Frankly, I mean, one of the and he said this many times. One of the things that made us do this project was Tom Steyer, who you probably all know because he's now become a huge climate activist, but was for many, 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 many years the founder and the head of Farallon Capital, one of the biggest hedge funds in California. And when he was at Farallon, he was invited to a Treasury Department meeting, and he had a high-level, private meeting in Treasury, dinner at Treasury, and it was all about the future of the U.S. economy. And they had this whole wide-ranging conversation for 3 hours or something, and not one time, at the end of it, he sort of raised his hand. He said, "Guys, I noticed that not one time in this conversation did anyone talk about energy and climate." And they said, "Oh, you're right, we should have talked about the shale boom because that's really critical to the US economy and it's going to move us in a new direction and we're going to get energy dependent." And he was like, no, actually what I meant was we didn't talk about climate change and the impact on the economy. And they essentially patted him on the head and said, "Oh, that's so nice that you're off doing your climate thing," right? But we're having a serious conversation here, right? Mm-hmm. And then Bob Rubin, who's part of our project too, goes to Bilderberg every year to the big economic conference there and had a very similar experience in Bilderberg. And Bob is actually a great example of what we're trying to do with this project. He was not a climate guy coming into this project. We wanted him involved because of his investment background and his experience. He wrote a very good book about risk and how to think about risk, particularly how to plan for tail risks and not just kind of what you expect to happen. And he we spent a lot of time with these guys on this project for the last year. He now will say, and he said at a series event here at the UN in January, that climate change is the existential crisis of our time. So he has really come around. But he speaks all over the world to economic conferences that have nothing to do with energy, and this issue does not come up.
You know where it also does not come up as much as you would expect it to is in the media. I mean, maybe a little bit similarly, I read an article in the New York Times, or in the New York Times really, but a few weeks ago about the housing market in the United States, right, and how the housing market hadn't returned to normal, but the normal that they were talking about was single-family tract development, and there was not a mention of the possibility that there might be an energy implication or a climate implication to if it does return to normal, and how serious that might be.
That's a great point. I mean, I think one of our goals here is to really get this on the business pages and not just the environmental desk, right? For the places that still have an environmental desk, which is almost nobody. But that's a great point. One of our kind of main things we always say about this project is there is no more business as usual, because everyone always is following out the business as usual curve on climate, and you can't do that and sustain our current way of life. So you have to think about new forms and new ways of living. And the housing thing has been really interesting to me. BMW is actually a really forward-looking company. And they about 5 or 6 years ago came to the Center for American Progress, where I was working at the time, and we had a great meeting with the head of BMW about their what they were calling at the time their mega city vehicle, which is now called something else, but it's their little electric car that's made of carbon fiber. I think it's called like E3 or some little thing like that. And they had this great vision. They came in and they said, we've been looking at urbanization and urban patterns, and we think that cities are getting smaller because of the housing bubble, but also because of the way people want to live their lives. People don't want to drive as much who are younger. People want to live closer to urban areas. We see a shrinking of global cities, and this goes to the earlier panel. It's an interesting question how that intersects with like China and population growth and middle class growth. But they said essentially in Europe and America, we see a shrinking of cities. We think we need to design vehicles for those new cities. So we're thinking about these small, light electric cars that people have, and then there's like a fleet of shared BMWs that people use if they want to take a road trip, right? And they started designing this vehicle, and one of the big things about their design of it was they said, we want to design it so the power, the energy going into it is very clean. So where did they locate their factory? In Washington State, because of the hydropower. So that's really interesting, and I just saw news today that they're expanding it. So I think that's, we should be thinking to these different forms, right? I mean, to the audience here, we should be thinking about, does urbanization look the same? Is it business as usual? Do we keep developing along these lines that were essentially lines that depended on cheap oil and plentiful oil, and oil that we didn't know the consequences of?
How does the question of social equity, not just one question, but all kinds of questions about social equity, play into your work? I know in your earlier career more explicitly, maybe you were at Center for American Progress, and in Wisconsin you worked on job development and kind of regional economic development. So how do you deal with the kind of frequent complaint that, oh, it's either the environment or jobs? And how is that playing out now?
I think there's two dimensions of this question. So on the jobs piece, I used to run an organization called the Apollo Alliance, which some of you may have known, which brought labor, environment, business, and community groups together around this sort of idea of a clean energy future that created a lot of jobs. And it was the sort of theory of a moonshot that we could, if we invested a significant amount in this issue, then we would come out with a kind of a new way of economic growth that was clean and job creating. And I still really believe in that. I will say that just like the California policies, we started Apollo at a time when this was an energy security issue. So Apollo's tagline, our logo was actually designed by Shepard Fairey, and it said energy security and clean and good jobs. Like those were our things that we were focused on. And the shale boom really did change that story. And I don't think we can underestimate how much it changed that story. But essentially, if we're talking about a transformation of the economy, we're talking about a potential situation with a whole bunch of new jobs. What's complicated about that is that unlike the old way of building, there's, you either have the Keystone Pipeline, which is a tangible thing with a whole bunch of construction jobs associated with it, or you can say, oh no, you don't have to do that. You can build 17 different clean energy projects in different parts of the country with different jobs and different outcomes and it's very hard to get people to get their heads around that. So it's a multifaceted answer, but it's also everywhere instead of just being in the places where the resources are. And I think that's a real positive. You can do clean energy anywhere, especially efficiency. Equity, though, also, so we have to have a good job story. We have to have a really concrete job story. We can't just say, oh, there are only 85,000 coal miners in the US and there's 110,000 people in the wind industry. Now, that's true, but that is not a very helpful statement when you're talking to people who are in communities where the only jobs available are in the coal industry. So I think we have to be as advocates, as people who care about this stuff, far more specific about what that alternative looks like and how to get to it. On the other equity point, though, I also think that we all, in the world of people who are aspirational and want this transformation to happen, sometimes we skip a few steps. So we tend to sort of say, we could be, and I agree with this, we could be at 80% renewables by 2030. We could be so much further down the line by X date. Everybody should be getting into electric cars. Everybody should be putting up solar. And in California, this is a big conversation we have. But you can't leave out people who are not in a place where those things work or are affordable right now. So electric cars, we are the single largest state, California, with electric cars. We only have 70,000 of them on the road. We're putting a lot more of them on the road every day. But if I'm a pen-dependent, low-income family in the Central Valley, which is the rural part of California, and I drive 100 or more miles a day to get to do my commute, And my car is one of the clunkers on our roads that's been on the road for over 20 years because our cars don't rust, so we have a lot of clunkers. They just don't rust. So we have between 2 and 3.5 million cars on the road in California that are over 20 years old. If I'm driving one of those cars, I'd like to get out of that car. I have neither the cash on hand nor the credit score to get into a lease or buy a new electric vehicle. It is just not an option. So what kinds of strategies do we have that are those interstitial strategies where we say, okay, what can we do to get you into a 5-year-old Honda, right? Instead of a 20-year-old Honda or whatever. What can we do to get you into a more efficient car that's getting you to be part of that solution and moving the state forward instead of sort of saying, you're not our target audience, we want to sell people EVs on the coasts. So I think that we just have to be like, A, thinking about tangible solutions, and B, thinking about where people are now and really thinking of these, like, where are those interstitial steps and how do we use them to get more efficiency, but also to get a whole lot more people to care about this issue. Because right now we just talk to each other a fair amount of the time.
Do you see anybody out there working on those things and specifically targeting the people in the 20-year-old cars and trying to help?
Well, I mean, I use that example because we just did a big project on it. So we just did a project. One of the things at Next Generation that we like to do, we're very communications focused. If there's one thing I learned at Center for American Progress, it's do policy and communications hand in hand. So we like to put light on issues that are being sort of ignored in the state. And we just did a big paper called No Californian Left Behind, which is all about those cars and policy in the state to get both better financing so people can get into new vehicles and they can scrap their old ones, but also to get efficiency standards on those new vehicles. And I'm happy to say that actually our Air Resources Board just came out with new regulations that are going in that direction. So we think we had a big impact. Just pointing this out. It was an example of a project, though. It sort of underscores the problem in a way with the nonprofit community because we were unable to get any funding for that. We did it all with our own staff and our own core funding because it fell at this weird point between all these people's issue areas. It was like we were talking about getting older cars off the road and putting newer cars on the road, which is an air quality issue in California. It's a smog issue. So the air quality funders don't fund climate people. And we were trying to talk about it as a climate issue. But the climate people don't fund air quality issues. So like we were falling in that area. And then we also, the entire environmental funder community in California is focused on electric vehicles. So every time we would go into a funder, they would say, we don't want to support putting people in cars that aren't electric. And we would be like, but that's actually not an option for a bunch of people. And so I think it underscores that we think about these things in silos to a great extent. And we need to start thinking about that. This is really, it's not an energy or a climate issue. It's not an air quality or a climate issue. It's really a how do we want our society to look and feel and how do we want to live issue.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to ask our next group of people to come up. But you mentioned before that you're a planner and and that you're very interested in regional issues. One of the things that has arisen in New York and not been resolved, it was an issue in New Orleans too, is that after a serious climate event, weather event like Sandy or Katrina, one approach would be to say that you need to move from this place because it's not safe to live on the coast. And when you talk about the coal miners and the coal industry in West Virginia or Kentucky, one approach would be, this industry is not going to make it, and so we need to, maybe you need to think about being someplace else. But I want to ask you with your planning hat on, because it is an issue about place and about equity. How do you think about those things and where, how individual choices in those things and collective choices should interact?
That's a great question. I mean, we all know that the world isn't flat, right? I mean, people don't just move really easily from the part of the world they're in to another part of the world. It's usually it's a forced resettlement issue if it happens. I think that we need to try as hard as we can to find choices for people that work for where they are and where the places they love, because we really do love the places we're in, mostly in the United States. And it's interesting. You look at the Appalachian Regional Commission, right? I mean, we used to do these big economic development plans that were all about kind of transitioning people out of industries and thinking about the effect in their communities. The Appalachian Regional Commission helped tobacco farmers get out of tobacco farming, but also did an enormous amount of regional planning in those areas and put a lot of government money into it. I would say my single biggest concern, actually, about this whole transition, putting aside Jeremy's point, which I absolutely agree with about the other side being very entrenched and powerful. I think that's a challenge. But the other big challenge is we don't live in an era anymore of big government investment in infrastructure or economic development. So every one of the systems that's in place today that we're trying to change was built with a massive amount of government money put into infrastructure. It was not the private sector putting that in. It was not innovation necessarily driving investment there. It was public sector building of the infrastructure underlying everything in our economy. I really do worry about how we get back to that in the era of no government spending. Because technology innovation is great and really, really exciting, but there are these these brick and mortar issues, like what happens in the coal community when the coal jobs go away, which they will. And how do we actually build that community back up to become a mountaintop wind community, for instance? How do you do that transition? You have to do it with some planning, and I do worry about that. Just on that point, one of the reasons that our budget is now balanced in California is because Governor Brown took away the entire redevelopment fund. So our state no longer has a redevelopment fund. So it's a great story at the state level. They didn't tell you that. It's a great story at the state level, but for all the planners who live in California, it's a nightmare. And one of the reasons we're getting some of that money back is because our cap and trade money program gets funds and it puts it back into sustainable planning. So the answer may be that we price carbon and that's where we get the money to do these things. I just worry that we don't have the political will to do that kind of economic growth strategy anymore.